The cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears, heavy with expectation. A woman in white glided past the rows of seats with a practiced air, scanning, choosing. Her eyes lingered not on the scenery, not on the sky but on him, the man sitting tall. Almost invisible to everyone else but somehow magnetic to her scrutiny. She didn't ask. She assumed. A polite clearance, a forced smile, then a hand on the armrest, claiming what wasn't hers. He didn't move, he didn't look up. Only a flicker of awareness crossed his eyes, sharp and cold, measuring her audacity. Around them, the air seemed to thicken, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. Whispers of entitlement, invisible to most, screamed. In the silence, she leaned forward, smug, certain she didn't know the weight of what she'd just challenged. The man's calm was a storm waiting to break. And in that moment, between assumption and reality, the first crack appeared. Some seats are earned, others are assumed. But which one was hers? The airplane cabin gleamed under sterile lights, a tunnel of polished metal and soft leather stretching ahead like a corridor of silent judgment. Outside, the clouds moved lazily, indifferent to the tiny dramas unfolding inside. Inside, however, the air was taut thick with expectation, subtle power plays, and invisible hierarchies. Every gesture, every glance, carried weight. First class smelled of perfume and privilege, a scent almost tangible, floating above the hum of the engines. The seats were wider here, the tables sharper, and every tray, pillow, and compartment whispered, statist. Some claimed it casually, as if the world owed it to them. Others sat quietly, aware of the constant, unspoken scrutiny. He observed it all, the polite nods, the sideways glances, the subtle tension that prickled when certain passengers realized someone didn't belong. He had seen this look before, countless times, etched into faces, like a mark of ownership over spaces, over voices, over lives. It was familiar, like a shadow that had followed him from boardrooms to streets, classrooms to offices. The woman in white moved deliberately, her shoes clicking softly against the aisle. She carried herself as though every glance should bow, every moment bend to her authority. Yet, beneath the surface, her confidence was brittle, built on assumptions she had never tested. The cabin became her stage, and he, unknowingly or perhaps knowingly, her test. Around them, the other passengers were ghosts in this theater. A faint cough, the rustle of magazines, a flight attendant adjusting a pillow. None noticed the tension humming between them, subtle and dangerous. It was in the way the woman's eyes lingered on his briefcase, the way her hand hovered over the armrest before she claimed it as her own. He didn't react. Calm, still, invisible to the untrained eye, but fully aware. The hum of the engines felt louder in his ears, matching the pulse in his mind. He thought of all the seats he'd occupied in life, all the spaces he had been questioned, judged, or dismissed from, not because he was unworthy, but because others assumed he was. Each assumption left a mark, each dismissal, a memory. Yet, today, the cabin felt different. The air felt electric. The boundaries of entitlement and authority were about to collide, and he was both observer and participant. The leather under his hand, smooth and cold, became a symbol of everything earned versus everything assumed. A tray table clicked open, and a newspaper slid slightly, revealing headlines he didn't need to read to understand. A world obsessed with status, obsessed with appearances. Every article was a mirror reflecting what society valued, and every reflection reminded him of what it had tried to take from him. The woman in white shifted, her presence expanding in the confined space. Privilege. She wore it like perfume, heady, overpowering, unearned. She didn't notice the subtle cracks yet. The passengers didn't notice. The flight attendants didn't notice. But he did. The invisible scale of justice had tilted long ago. Today, it would find balance. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember the countless flights, the countless rooms, the countless stages where assumptions had greeted him like gatekeepers. Each time, he had remained silent, measured, almost invisible. But not today. Today, the quiet storm inside him was waiting to speak in ways the world couldn't ignore. And then, a soft laugh, almost imperceptible, slipped from the woman's lips as she adjusted herself, seating herself firmly where she believed she belonged. It was a laugh meant to dominate, to claim space, to assert control. But in its echo, the cabin seemed to hum differently, a subtle tension, a promise, unspoken. The world was about to remind her that not all power was visible. Not all authority assumed. The engines roared to life. The flight attendants prepared the cabin, and the clouds outside shifted. The journey had only begun. Every glance, every micro-expression, every breath in this confined sky would carry the weight of history, expectation, and the subtle dance between entitlement and achievement. Somewhere, between altitude and atmosphere, a single truth hovered, waiting to be realized. Not every seat could be claimed. Not every authority was hers. And in the stillness of first class, a storm brewed quietly, invisible to all but those who understood its gravity. She had no idea that the seat she took was more than leather and metal. It was the edge of a reckoning. The man adjusted the cuff of his suit, smooth leather brushing against his wristwatch, a reminder of every early morning, every late night, every barrier he had broken to reach this point. Outside the airplane windows, clouds drifted lazily, but inside, the confined space of first class mirrored the world he had navigated for decades, controlled, polished, and full of invisible walls. Every row, every passenger, every smile carried unspoken rules about who belonged and who did not. Allowed himself a moment to reflect. This wasn't just another flight. It was another stage in a life punctuated by assumptions. He had built companies from nothing, negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, and earned respect in rooms that were rarely meant for him. Yet, even at the pinnacle of his success, there was always that fleeting glance, the subtle hesitation from those who assumed his place wasn't real, wasn't deserved. The first-class cabin, for all its luxury, carried a quiet hierarchy. Passengers were divided, not only by ticket price but by unspoken judgment. A woman passed with a smile, two sweet eyes lingering on him, not recognition, but assessment. Small, almost invisible cues, a slight narrowing of her eyes, a tilt of the head, a purse held a fraction closer. These microaggressions were familiar. Each one was a whisper of the world's assumptions, a reminder that entitlement often masqueraded as authority. He remembered other moments like this. In conference rooms, he had seen colleagues sidestep him, deflect credit, or ignore ideas until repeated by someone else. In schools, he had been underestimated, his intelligence questioned not by proof but by color. In restaurants and theaters, he had noticed the careful spacing, the unconscious distancing, the unspoken "you don't belong here." Each encounter left traces, invisible yet heavy, weighing on a soul forced to prove itself continuously. Yet, he carried pride in his restraint. Composed, measured, composed, that composure had carried him through countless encounters that could have turned ugly. Countless flights like this, where entitlement sought to claim what wasn't theirs. He had learned to observe, to wait, to let the world reveal itself in its own arrogance. The quiet accumulation of injustice sharpened his senses, and he had honed an awareness few could perceive, the subtle ways in which power and assumption collided. Now, as the cabin hummed with the soft clatter of service trolleys and muted conversation, he noticed the woman in white again. She had chosen the seat directly across from him, her movements deliberate, confident, claiming space she assumed was hers by default. She arranged herself, smoothed her dress, adjusted her hair, all gestures of dominance, entitlement, and expectation. He recognized it immediately. She had never questioned her authority, because the world had rarely required her to. A pang of irritation rose not at her personally, but at the system that had allowed her assumptions to feel justified. His pulse remained calm, a steady metronome against the subtle storm building in the cabin. Every movement she made, every glance she cast, was catalogued, measured, and silently weighed against reality. He had long since learned the difference between assumption and truth, between perceived power and actual authority. His mind drifted to the wristwatch again, a gift from his first investor, the one who had believed in him when others had laughed. The watch wasn't expensive, but it was symbolic, every tick a reminder of perseverance, of the hours poured into building legitimacy, of the constant effort to carve space in a world predisposed to doubt him. Every glance at it renewed his focus. He had earned his seat in life as much as in this cabin. Nearby, the woman shifted again, a subtle frown crossing her face as if sensing resistance, though she could not identify its source. The passengers around them remained oblivious, caught in their own private worlds, but the cabin felt alive with tension. Each subtle movement weighted with history and unspoken social rules. He reflected on his internal fear, that despite every achievement, the world might still reduce him to assumptions and stereotypes. that, despite every triumph, there would always be someone ready to test his place, to challenge what he had earned with mere entitlement. It was a fear rooted in years of subtle, unrelenting prejudice battles, fought in boardrooms, restaurants, schools, streets wars, waged without the world noticing. Yet, even in that fear, he found clarity. Understanding the system was his advantage. Knowing its rhythms and patterns gave him power far beyond the arrogance of others. The woman in white finally leaned back, smirking, certain she had claimed dominance, but in her smugness, she revealed a critical vulnerability, her ignorance of history, of reality, of the man seated before her. The man observed, noting every detail, the tilt of her head, the imperceptible tightening of her jaw, the faint impatience, as if the universe itself had delayed the recognition of her authority. Even now, small injustices rippled around them. A flight attendant hesitated, uncertain which passenger to prioritize. A nearby couple exchanged an almost imperceptible glance, a silent judgment of entitlement in motion. The man watched, fully aware of the ecosystem of assumptions, privilege, and power dynamics that surrounded him. Each micro-interjection reminded him this was not an isolated moment. It was a pattern, one repeated endlessly in society, across spaces both grand and ordinary. He allowed a small inward smile, not of malice, but of patience. He understood the rhythm, the assumption, the test, the arrogance. It was predictable, and he had mastered the art of waiting for reality to reveal itself. Today, the woman had claimed her seat, but she had yet to understand the true measure of authority, the quiet gravity of earned power. The engines hummed beneath them, a steady backdrop to the human drama unfolding above the clouds. The soft clink of cutlery, the muted murmur of conversation, even the subtle sway of the planol, seemed to conspire in a delicate balance of tension. In that confined cabin, history and society, pride and prejudice, entitlement and achievement collided, quietly but unmistakably, and as the man leaned back, closing his eyes for a brief moment of reflection, the air seemed to hold its breath. The first-class cabin, a gilded microcosm of the world outside, was a stage, and soon, very soon, the script would demand its reckoning. She thought the seat was hers. She had no idea who had already claimed the power behind it. The cabin hummed with the low vibration of the engines, but to him, the world felt louder, the quiet judgments, the invisible measurements of worth, the subtle hierarchy of entitlement. Every movement around him carried weight. Every glance was an evaluation. The woman in white had settled, yet her presence was oppressive. It wasn't just the seat she assumed, it was the arrogance, the certainty, the unspoken message that some spaces belonged to her simply because she had decided so. She tapped her fingernails against the armrest, the sound a soft drumbeat of irritation or impatience, and he felt it, more sharply than he wanted to admit. Around them, passengers adjusted their positions unconsciously, maintaining distance from her dominance, giving her space she had not earned. His gaze flickered to a magazine left carelessly on the tray table, glossy pages full of stories about wealth, power, and influence, all curated as if to remind the world who deserved to be seen. Yet here, the narrative was incomplete. He knew the truth, and she did not. Subtle signs of disrespect began to accumulate, like pebbles forming a landslide. A flight attendant hesitated at her seat, unsure whether to address him first. She leaned slightly forward as if she had the authority to claim the attention that was his. Her eyes flicked to his briefcase. The one that carried more than papers, it carried decades of perseverance and proof of earned achievement. Her smirk tightened when she realized he wasn't responding, wasn't flinching, wasn't conceding. It wasn't anger that pulsed inside him. It was awareness, sharpened and patient. He had learned to read these moments, the faint curl of lips, the half-smile of superiority, the casual assumption of space. In boardrooms, restaurants, conferences, even streets, these were the mics that reminded him he was perpetually measured against a standard that had little to do with merit. He had grown skilled at detecting entitlement, like a sixth sense honed over decades. That the woman shifted again, brushing against the armrest with calculated precision, asserting herself as though proximity could override reality. Each motion she made was a quiet insult, a reminder of how some people assumed authority they hadn't earned. Around them, the cabin remained polite and oblivious, the other passengers blissfully unaware of the social tension charging the air. Yet to him, every gesture was a test, a challenge that had been placed deliberately or unconsciously. He thought of the countless times society had attempted to erase him, to diminish his presence. Each glance, each whisper, each assumption had been a small fracture in a larger system designed to keep him invisible. But invisibility was a weapon he had mastered. While others assumed they held power, he observed, measured, waited. Patience was not weakness, it was strategy. And now, in this small yet potent theater of first-class luxury, patience would exact its quiet justice. She laughed softly to herself, a light, careless sound meant to unsettle, to claim dominance. Yet there was a crack beneath the surface, subtle but real. The arrogance in her posture masked uncertainty and untested assumption waiting to meet reality. He noticed it immediately. That was the difference. He knew the weight of every claim, every entitlement, every assumption that had ever been laid upon him, and he was ready. The cabin crew moved carefully, offering drinks and menus, balancing politeness with subtle attention. She ordered a wine with a practiced air, as if her choice alone could dictate the rhythm of service. He allowed her the performance. Inside, he catalogued every detail, her timing, her expressions, her assumed authority. All of it was evidence, a narrative she could not see unfolding beyond her assumptions. Whispers began to echo faintly in his mind, reminders of the small injustices he had endured. A teacher who questioned his intelligence in school, a colleague who presented his ideas as their own, a doorman who ignored his presence until recognition was inevitable. Each memory merged with the present, each microaggression amplifying the weight of her entitlement. It was not personnel, it was systemic, but personal, it felt, every time. He shifted slightly in his seat, letting his eyes meet hers in a deliberate glance, calm yet unyielding. It was a silent confrontation, invisible to others but powerful in its presence. She recoiled slightly, unaware of the storm she had provoked. Around them, the cabin remained neutral, a stage on which the drama of entitlement and earned authority played out quietly. Every tap of her nails, every glance of superiority, every subtle smirk became a thread in the tension weaving itself around them. The air between them crackled with anticipation, a slow-building crescendo of unspoken conflict. The world outside continued as if unaware, but inside, the dynamics of power, race, and entitlement collided in ways that were palpable. And then, as the engines hummed and the plane leveled at cruising altitude, a shift occurred. The small, almost imperceptible cracks in her composure began to widen. Her smirk faltered. Her movements, once assured, carried hesitation. She had not yet realized the scale of authority before her, the invisible weight of someone who had earned every inch she assumed she could claim. In that moment, he understood the quiet power of observation, of patience, of knowing one's own value in a world that constantly measured him against assumptions. The cabin had become a battlefield of microaggressions and silent resistance. And the first shot had been fired without words, without violence, just presence. She had claimed the seat. She had no idea the man before her had been waiting all his life for this moment to unfold. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. She had leaned back, smug and assured, certain that her claim over the seat and, by extension, the space was uncontested. But a quiet shift had begun, imperceptible to most, undeniable to him. The man in the seat she assumed was ordinary, was far from ordinary. He carried himself with a calm that betrayed decades of perseverance, silent victories, and earned authority. It started subtly, a glance from a flight attendant, the way a service tray hesitated in her hand, the careful tilt of a magazine toward him rather than her. The signs were small, almost invisible, yet they carried a weight impossible to ignore. She noticed it, though only barely. There was a faint unease creeping across her confidence, a disturbance she could neither name nor understand, and then it happened. A soft murmur from a nearby passenger. "Isn't that him? The CEO of SkyNation Airlines?" The words floated in the air like a slow-moving storm. She turned her head sharply, the color draining from her face as recognition collided violently with assumption. The reality was undeniable. The man she had assumed was beneath her, merely a passenger, someone she could dismiss with a glance, was the owner of the very airline they occupied. Time slowed. Every detail became hyperreal. The seatbelt buckle gleamed in the overhead light. The tray table reflected her wide, unguarded eyes. The soft hum of the engines became a drumbeat of humiliation. Her earlier gestures of entitlement, each confident, lean, each touch on the armrest, each micro-smile of superiority, now felt grotesque in their absurdity. She had claimed space she did not own, arrogance draped over ignorance, and it had been observed, calculated, measured, and understood by the very person she sought to dominate. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile decades of assumptions with this single, shattering revelation. The veneer of confidence cracked, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. Pride collided with reality, a clash that left her physically stiff, unable to form a coherent thought. Around her, the cabin remained, a silent theater. Passengers pretended not to notice, yet in the subtle flicker of glances, judgment rippled like waves across water. He did not speak. He did not gloat. He simply allowed the truth to settle, heavy and undeniable, in the space between them. That silence was a weapon, sharper than any words. The woman's thoughts spiraled. How could she have been so wrong? How could she have assumed authority, power, and entitlement where none existed? The mental unraveling was immediate and violent, though invisible to everyone but him. She remembered past moments of her own assumptions, the subtle ways she had claimed spaces, judged people by appearances, dismissed others without proof. And now, in the confined pressure of first class, every unearned claim, every unconscious prejudice, every flicker of entitlement returned to her as a tidal wave. She felt exposed, small, insignificant in the shadow of someone whose life had been a relentless accumulation of earned victories. The cabin's luxury seemed to shrink around her. The leather under her fingers became a reminder of what she had assumed. The gleaming metal of the armrest a silent judge. Even the faint click of the overhead bins felt like an accusation, punctuating every stolen moment of confidence she had relied on. She wanted to apologize, to retreat, to erase the assumption she had made, but the realization had already cemented itself into memory, irreversible and complete. He observed all of it, quietly, internally reflecting. The calm in his chest was not malice, nor triumph. It was the patience of someone who understood the rhythm of life's injustices, and the rare, delicate satisfaction when reality aligned with truth. The seat she had claimed symbolized entitlement. He had always known that, and now the lesson was unfolding with precision. A memory surfaced years ago. In a boardroom, a colleague had dismissed his ideas with the same casual superiority, assuming that status and skin dictated intelligence. A teacher had once written a note implying he did not belong in advanced classes. Each memory, once painful, now amplified the irony of the moment. The woman in white, arrogant and untested, was now facing a reflection of the systemic entitlement he had navigated his entire life. Her gaze met his, frantic, seeking an explanation that would undo the truth. But there was none, only presence, only calm, only the unspoken weight of experience that could not be challenged by assumption. Her internal collapse was mirrored in every tiny gesture, shoulders stiffening, breath catching, fingers trembling over the armrest. He allowed her the briefest of mental notes, a reminder that power, respect, and authority were not granted by appearance, by entitlement, or by assumption. They were earned, quietly, persistently, often invisibly. And now, in the confines of a single cabin, the lesson had arrived, undeniable and absolute. Even the subtle observers, the passengers, the crew were swept into the wave of realization. A faint tension vibrated through the cabin. It was invisible, yet undeniable, a ripple across a still pond, reminding everyone present that assumptions carried consequences. She sat frozen, confronted with her own arrogance, unable to undo the revelation, unable to reclaim the false authority she had so carelessly asserted. And in the calm reflection of the man across from her, the cabin's luxury and comfort became irrelevant. The true power in the room was no longer in appearances, but in reality, earned and quietly demonstrated. She had assumed she held control, but some truths cannot be unlearned. The cabin seemed smaller now, the air heavier, each movement magnified. She shifted again, uncertain, her previous confidence shredded into sharp fragments she couldn't piece together. The leather seat beneath her felt suddenly foreign, as if it no longer belonged to her. Every inch she had claimed, every gesture of entitlement, now recoiled with the force of undeniable truth. He remained calm, observing not with cruelty, but with the quiet patience of someone who had endured a lifetime of assumptions. His presence was a force she could not contest, invisible yet undeniable. The calm of his demeanor struck harder than any words, any accusation. He did not need to speak. The weight of earned authority, the subtle gravity of decades of perseverance, hung between them, palpable and suffocating. Her hands trembled slightly over the armrest, a nervous twitch, a faint tightening of her jaw. The world she had assumed, she dominated, was crumbling under the revelation of reality. Passengers stole glances, sensing the shift, though they could not name it. The cabin had become a stage for a silent reckoning. She recalled every unchallenged assumption she had carried throughout her life, the casual dismissals, the entitlement she wore like perfume, the belief that space and power were inherited rather than earned. And now, every one of those assumptions mocked her silently, reflected in the quiet strength of the man before her. He shifted slightly, fingers brushing the edge of the seat with deliberate precision. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, yet it carried authority. It was a silent declaration. The seat, the space, the power, these were his, not because he demanded them, not because he boasted, but because he had earned them. She swallowed hard, aware that every subtle movement, every microexpression she had directed at him, was now visible in its absurdity. The smug smirk she had worn moments ago had no place in this space. The arrogance that had defined her presence was stripped bare. Around them, the cabin remained formally polite, but the atmosphere crackled. Flight attendants moved with careful awareness. Passengers shifted slightly in their seats, sensing the change. The weight of justice was intangible, yet undeniable, pressing on the small confined space like gravity. Her internal collapse mirrored the poetic justice of the moment. She had assumed superiority, entitlement, and control, but the truth revealed her ignorance. The man across from her, calm and composed, was a living testament to perseverance, to quiet authority earned against every obstacle the world had placed in his path. Every assumption she had made now carried the sting of embarrassment, a humbling she could not escape. Time seemed to stretch. Each second became a beat in a silent symphony of revelation. She leaned back, trying to reclaim composure, but the cracks were evident. The subtle tension that had simmered through the flight now reached its peak. Vibrating with the quiet satisfaction of unseen victories, he allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile, a private acknowledgement of justice quietly administered. It was not cruelty. It was the calm satisfaction of someone who had lived with systemic bias, witnessed countless assumptions, and finally, in a small theater high above the clouds, observed the balance tip toward truth. Her gaze met his one final time, wide and searching, begging for a word that would undo the revelation, but no word could. The weight of reality settled like a stone in her chest. The assumptions she had carried, the arrogance she had wielded so carelessly, were irrevocable now in their exposure. The engines hummed, a deep, constant undercurrent, but their noise was insignificant against the charged silence between them. He leaned back, posture relaxed, aura of quiet power undeniable. She had no choice but to confront the truth, to acknowledge that some seats were not hers to claim, some authority not hers to assume, some victories not hers to inherit. There were no words, just the slow, undeniable collapse of everything she had thought she owned. The plane hummed steadily as it glided above the clouds, but the tension that had gripped the cabin had not fully dissipated. Around them, life continued. Passengers adjusted seats, flight attendants moved silently, and the world outside remained oblivious. Yet within the first-class cabin, a subtle shift lingered, like the echo of a storm that had passed but left its mark. She remained frozen in her seat, her hands clutching the armrest as if to anchor herself to a reality that had just betrayed her. Every movement she had made in the past, the assumptions, the subtle dominance, the untested authority, now felt painfully absurd. In the quiet of reflection, she realized the gravity of the misjudgment. She had treated a man as ordinary when he was anything but. She had assumed entitlement when none existed, and the consequences had been internal, intimate, and inescapable. The man remained composed, a study in calm and dignity. He did not gloat, did not revel in the collapse of her arrogance. He simply existed in the equilibrium of earned authority, the quiet testament to a life built against invisible barriers. His thoughts were reflective, tracing back decades of struggle, of assumptions that had tried to define him, of microaggressions endured with patience, and victories claimed without spectacle. He thought of the seat, the leather beneath him, the small confined space of the cabin. It had become more than a piece of furniture. It was a symbol of life's broader truths. Some spaces could be assumed, taken lightly, without consequence. Others required endurance, skill, and the unyielding pursuit of legitimacy. He had always known the difference. Today, it had been confirmed. Around the cabin, subtle cues echoed the shift. A passenger glanced briefly, sensing the story without understanding it. A flight attendant offered service with careful acknowledgement, now attuned to the dynamic that had quietly unfolded. The woman's gaze met his one last time, wide and searching, a silent acknowledgement of both defeat and lesson. There were no words, no apology, no reconciliation needed. The revelation had been enough. He reflected on the broader pattern, the systemic imbalance that allowed assumptions to thrive unchecked. One cabin could not change the world, nor could one revelation repair decades of inequity. Yet in this microcosm, justice had arrived quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. Her internal turmoil mirrored the lesson of the space they shared. Entitlement without understanding could never match authority earned through perseverance. Every moment of her arrogance had been met with patience, every assumption catalogued, every microaggression weighed against a life of deliberate achievement. She had been forced to witness the disparity between assumed and earned power, and the lesson was indelible. As the flight continued, the man allowed himself a small internal sigh, a release of tension. The storm of confrontation had passed, but its imprint lingered in the air. The seat, once a simple place to rest, had become a symbol, a marker of what is earned versus what is assumed, a quiet monument to resilience, patience, and subtle justice. He thought back to the first glance she had cast, smug and unaware, and allowed a final reflection. The world would continue to test him, to measure him against outdated assumptions, to question his authority at every turn. Yet each test was now a reminder, not a burden. He had navigated this storm before, and he would navigate countless others. Patience, presence, and earned authority were shields no assumption could penetrate. The woman in white shrank slightly in her seat. The lesson etched into her consciousness. She would remember, quietly, painfully, the moment when her assumptions collided with reality, when entitlement met earned power, when arrogance confronted patience. It was a moment she could neither undo nor escape, a subtle reckoning that would linger far beyond the confines of the flight. And somewhere, above the clouds, the man allowed a final, reflective thought to settle in his mind, that while the world would not always recognize equity, and while systemic injustice would persist, there remained power in quiet vigilance, in resilience, in the relentless pursuit of one's rightful place. Some seats were assumed, some seats were earned. And in this skybound microcosm, the distinction had been made undeniable. Justice didn't announce itself with words, but neither did ignorance go unmarked this time.